Did you know the Duke of Wellington, that quintessential British icon, actually spoke with an Irish accent? Beyond the stiff upper lip and battlefield prowess, his formative years in Dublin and leadership over Anglo-Irish regiments forged a strategic mind steeped in a heritage often forgotten. Prepare to have your perception of this legendary figure completely transformed. When we think of Arthur Wellesley, the first Duke of Wellington, our minds inevitably conjure the image of the Iron Duke, a stoic, unyielding symbol of British imperial power. We see the victor of Waterloo, the man who humbled Napoleon, standing tall in a red coat, the very embodiment of English fortitude. But this image, polished by 2 centuries of national myth-making, obscures a more complex and fascinating reality. To understand the man who would redraw the map of Europe, we must look not to the rolling hills of southern England, but across the Irish Sea, to the vibrant, chaotic streets of late 18th century Dublin. Arthur Wellesley, as the family name was then spelled, was born in the spring of 1769. While history books often glaze over his origins, placing him firmly in the pantheon of English heroes, the records tell a different story. He was born at Mornington House, 24 Upper Merrion Street, in the heart of Dublin. This was not merely a geographical accident. He was a scion of the Protestant ascendancy, that unique and often contradictory class of Anglo-Irish aristocracy who ruled Ireland, yet were never quite fully English. His childhood was not spent in the manicured gardens of an English country estate, but largely at Dangan Castle in County Meath. Today, Dangan is a ruin, a ghost of its former self, much like the memory of Wellington's Irishness. But in the 1770s, it was a place of wild imagination and financial precarity. The Wellesleys were a musical, eccentric family, perpetually teetering on the edge of debt, a common trait among the ascendancy. This environment, less rigid and arguably more chaotic than that of his English counterparts, shaped young Arthur. He grew up navigating a world of contrasts, the grandeur of Dublin's Georgian squares against the poverty of the tenant farmers, the privilege of his class against the simmering resentment of the disenfranchised Catholic majority. It is here, in these formative years, that we find the roots of his character. The young Arthur was not the confident commander of later years. He was awkward, solitary, and considered the dunce of the family by his own mother, who famously despaired of his prospects, calling him food for powder and nothing more. Yet, this isolation in the Irish countryside perhaps bred the self-reliance and the cool, detached observation that would become his trademark on the battlefield. He learned to watch, to assess, and to keep his own counsel. The Dublin of his youth was a city of intense political and social energy. It was the second city of the empire, a place where the Anglo-Irish identity was fiercely debated. This was the world of Grattan's Parliament, a time when the ascendancy briefly dreamed of a distinct Irish nationhood within the empire. While Wellesley would later become a staunch unionist, he could not escape the cultural imprint of his birthplace. He walked streets where the accents were thick, the humour dark, and the politics cutthroat. It is said that even late in life, despite his polished exterior, traces of an Irish lilt would surface when he was angry or excited, a linguistic ghost of his Dublin past. There is a famous, often misquoted line attributed to Wellington. Being born in a stable does not make one a horse. It has been used for generations to prove his disdain for his Irish roots, to paint him as a man who rejected his birthright. But historical detective work suggests this quote was likely a fabrication, an insult hurled at him by his great political rival, the Irish nationalist Daniel O'Connell. In reality, Wellington never denied his origins. He simply embodied the complex, often uncomfortable dual identity of his class. He was an Irishman who served the crown, a man of Dublin who commanded the armies of London. To ignore this duality is to miss the key to his genius. The Anglo-Irish aristocracy produced a disproportionate number of the era's leading military minds. Men like Pakenham, Beresford and Wolseley shared this background. They were raised in a culture that valued horsemanship, physical courage, and a certain rough and ready pragmatism. They were accustomed to living on the edge, to managing volatile situations, to leading men who were culturally different from themselves. These were the very skills Arthur Wellesley would take with him when he finally traded the green fields of Meath for the red coat of the King's army. As we peel back the layers of Victorian historiography, a new picture emerges. We see not a monolithic English statue, but a man forged in the unique crucible of Ireland. His strategic mind was not a product of rote learning at an English academy, but of a life lived between two worlds. The resilience he showed in the face of Napoleon's marshals, the ability to read the terrain, the intuitive understanding of his soldiers' temperaments, these were not gifts from above. They were the hard-won lessons of a boy from County Meath, who grew up to conquer the world. The journey of the Iron Duke begins not with a march, but with a birth in Dublin, and it is there that our investigation into the true nature of his leadership must start. By 1787, the aimless youth found his calling, or perhaps more accurately, his calling was found for him by a family desperate to secure his future. Arthur Wellesley entered the British Army, but the army he joined was not the homogeneous English force of popular imagination. It was a complex, multinational machine, and its engine room was disproportionately Irish. As we scrutinize the muster rolls and regimental histories of the late 18th century, a startling statistic leaps off the page. By the time the Napoleonic Wars reached their fever pitch, estimates suggest that between 30 and 40% of the British Army's rank and file were Irishmen. This is a historical optical illusion that has persisted for 2 centuries. When we look at paintings of the era, we see the red coat, the symbol of British power. But beneath that uniform often beat an Irish heart. For the young Arthur, now rising through the ranks with the help of his brother's influence and purchased commissions, this was not an abstract demographic fact. It was his daily reality. His initial service saw him bouncing between regiments, a common practice for ambitious officers seeking promotion. But his true education began when he took command of the 33rd Regiment of Foot in 1793. The 33rd was technically a Yorkshire regiment, known by the nickname the Havercake Lads, after a type of oatcake popular in the West Riding. However, under Wellesley's command, which was frequently based in Dublin, the regiment absorbed a significant influx of Irish recruits. The British Army was chronically short of manpower, and Ireland, with its growing population and limited economic opportunities, was a fertile recruiting ground. The recruiting sergeants scoured the fairs and market towns, offering the king's shilling to young men who often had few other choices. Here in the barracks of Dublin, and later on transport ships, Wellesley began his true apprenticeship. He was an Anglo-Irish aristocrat, commanding men who were often the sons of the very tenant farmers his class ruled over. This dynamic created a unique microcosm of Irish society within the regiment. The officers, men like Wellesley, his brother-in-law Edward Pakenham, and William Beresford, represented the ascendancy. The private soldiers were largely Catholic, Gaelic-speaking, and culturally distinct from their commanders. Yet, a curious social alchemy occurred within these regiments. The tension that existed on the land, the resentment of the landlord by the tenant, was transmuted into a fierce, if rough, esprit de corps. The Anglo-Irish officers understood these men in a way an English officer from the home counties might not. They knew the language, literally and metaphorically. They understood the devastating poverty from which these soldiers had escaped, and they knew that for many, the regiment was the first institution that had ever fed and clothed them with regularity. Wellesley's genius lay in his lack of sentimentality, combined with a rigorous attention to detail. He did not view his Irish soldiers with the romanticism of later poets, nor with the pure disdain of some of his English contemporaries. He viewed them as raw material. He understood that the Irish soldier, often stereotyped as undisciplined or prone to drink, possessed a terrifying capacity for aggression and endurance if properly led. The relationship was transactional but deeply functional. The soldier gave his loyalty and his life. The officer ensured he was fed, repaid and not thrown away needlessly in battle. This period was the laboratory where Wellesley's leadership style crystallized. He learned that loyalty in an army of mercenaries and desperate men was not given freely. It had to be manufactured through discipline and success. He saw firsthand the paradox of the Irish soldier fighting for a king who legally discriminated against his religion. It was a contradiction that would have paralyzed a lesser mind, but Wellesley accepted it as the way of the world. He realized that the green component of the Redcoats was its spine. As the 33rd prepared for foreign service, Wellesley was no longer just the awkward boy from Dangan Castle. He was a lieutenant colonel who had begun to master the art of managing the diverse, volatile, and hardy men who made up the British Empire's shock troops. He was learning that an army is not just a collection of muskets, but a living organism with a distinct temperament. And the temperament of his army was becoming increasingly Irish. The stage was now set for this theory to be tested in the harshest possible crucible. The 33rd was shipping out, not to the familiar fields of Europe, but to the sweltering heat and dust of India, where the lessons of Dublin would be applied on a continental scale. In 1797, Arthur Wellesley arrived in Calcutta. If Dublin had been a place of political complexity, India was a world of staggering scale and sensory overload. The humidity wrapped around men like a wet blanket, and the sheer vastness of the subcontinent threatened to swallow armies whole. It was here, thousands of miles from the oversight of London, that the colonel truly became the general. India was not merely a posting. It was a crucible that burned away the last vestiges of the amateur aristocrat, leaving behind a hardened professional. For the next 8 years, Wellesley immersed himself in the grime and glory of empire building. He quickly realized that in this unforgiving environment, battle was the easy part. The real war was against geography and starvation. He became obsessed with logistics. He counted bullock carts, calculated grain yields, and mapped river crossings. He understood that before a soldier could fight, he had to be fed and moved. This unglamorous fixation on the business of war would later become the bedrock of his success in Europe, but he learned it on the dusty plains of the Deccan. His forces in India were a motley collection that reflected the global reach of the British Empire. He commanded king's regiments, like his own 33rd and the Highlanders of the 74th and 78th. But the bulk of his force consisted of sepoys, native troops of the East India Company. And leading these diverse units was a cadre of officers and NCOs, often drawn from the same pool as Wellesley himself, the Anglo-Irish. India was a magnet for the younger sons of the Irish gentry, men with names like Barry, Collins, and Stevenson, who sought the fortune and status in the East that was denied to them at home. They brought with them that specific brand of adaptability and daring that Wellesley knew how to exploit. The supreme test of this diverse machine came on September 23, 1803, at the village of Asai. It is a name that should be as famous as Waterloo, for it was here that Wellesley fought what he later described as the hardest fought battle of his life. Facing the massive Maratha army, which numbered at least 40,000 men and boasted over 100 European-trained guns, Wellesley had barely 7,000 troops at his disposal. By all conventional military logic, he should have retreated. To attack was suicide. But Wellesley did not retreat. In a move that foreshadowed the aggressive opportunism he would display later in his career, he spotted a singular weakness, a ford across the River Kytna that the enemy had left unguarded. Without waiting for reinforcements, he hurled his small force across the river and into the teeth of the Maratha guns. What followed was a slaughter. The Maratha artillery was terrifyingly effective, tearing holes in the British lines. The 74th Highlanders were decimated, reduced to a huddled remnant around their colours. It was a moment where the army could have broken, but the discipline held. The sepoys stood firm alongside the king's regiments, and the cavalry, led by the dashing 19th Light Dragoons, charged into the smoke. Wellesley himself was in the thick of it, having 2 horses shot out from under him. He was not the distant commander on a hill. He was right there in the blood and the dust, physically urging his men forward. When the smoke finally cleared, the Maratha army had fled, leaving 98 guns on the field. The victory was complete, but the cost was staggering. Wellesley had lost over a third of his men. Walking the battlefield that night by moonlight, stepping over the bodies of friends and foes alike, he was deeply shaken. He wrote to a friend that he hoped to never see such a loss again. A sigh was the making of him. It proved that he could maneuver a numerically inferior force to victory through speed, terrain analysis, and sheer nerve. It also cemented his faith in his mixed force. He had seen Irish sergeants, Scottish Highlanders, and Indian sepoys fight and die with equal courage. He realized that a commander's job was to unify these disparate elements into a single will. The man who sailed back to Britain in 1805 was no longer the sepoy general, a derisive nickname given to him by snobbish contemporaries. He was a master of modern warfare, carrying with him the hard lessons of the East, ready to face the greatest threat Europe had ever known. He was ready for Napoleon, but first he would have to take his Irish heavy army to the rugged mountains of Portugal. In 1808, Arthur Wellesley, soon to be Viscount Wellington, stepped onto the Iberian Peninsula to confront the French Empire. The war in Spain and Portugal would become known as the Spanish Ulcer, a bleeding wound in Napoleon's side that would never heal. But for Wellington, it was the ultimate test of the military machine he had helped construct. The army he brought to the peninsula was a unique entity, a collection of vagabonds, mercenaries, and patriots, and once again, the accent of the campfires was unmistakable. As we examine the composition of the Peninsular Army, one regiment stands out above all others, capturing the essence of this wild, terrifying force. The 88th Regiment of Foot, the Connaught Rangers. Recruited from the wild west of Ireland, from the stone-walled fields of Galway, Mayo, and Roscommon, these men were the stuff of nightmares for their officers and the enemy alike. In camp, they were notorious. They were brawlers, looters, and master foragers who could strip a countryside bare in hours. General Thomas Picton, a man not easily impressed, famously christened them the Connaught Footpads for their thievery. But he also gave them another name that would stick forever: the Devil's Own. Why did Wellington, a man of strict discipline and aristocratic bearing, tolerate such chaos? Because he knew that the very qualities that made the 88th a headache in peace made them invincible in war. Their ferocity was not manufactured, it was innate. These were men hardened by a life of subsistence farming and social marginalization. They had nothing to lose but their lives, and they sold those dearly. Wellington famously described his army as the scum of the earth, a quote that has been endlessly analyzed. But read the full sentence and the meaning shifts. He said they were the scum of the earth who had been enlisted for drink, but added, "It is really wonderful that we should have made them the fine fellows they are." It was a statement of pride, not just disgust. He had taken the roughest elements of society and forged them into a weapon that could break the French columns. The true test of this weapon came at the Battle of Salamanca in July 1812. This battle is widely considered Wellington's masterpiece, the moment he proved he could attack as brilliantly as he could defend. The French Marshal Marmont, believing Wellington to be cautious and defensive, overextended his left flank, leaving a gap in his line. Wellington, watching from a high ridge, spotted the error instantly. He threw away his lunch, a chicken leg according to legend, and declared, "By God, that will do." He rode furiously to the 3rd Division, which was hidden behind a hill. This division was commanded by his own brother-in-law, another Anglo-Irishman, Edward Pakenham. The 3rd Division was the home of the Connaught Rangers. The scene that followed is one of the most cinematic in military history. Wellington rode up to Pakenham, pointed to the French columns marching unknowingly across their front, and gave a simple, brutal order. "Ned, do you see those fellows on the hill? Drive them to the devil. Pakenham didn't salute. He simply replied, "I will, my lord," and ordered the advance. The 88th, alongside the 45th and 74th, rose from the ground and surged forward. The French were caught completely off guard. They expected a skirmish line. Instead, they were hit by a wall of screaming Irishmen. The Connaught Rangers did not stop to fire volleys. They went straight in with the bayonet. The shock was absolute. The French division, thousands of men strong, effectively evaporated in minutes, shattered by the sheer violence of the assault. This was the Irish soldier at the zenith of his power. Led by an Anglo-Irish general, commanded by an Anglo-Irish officer, and filled with men from the impoverished west of Ireland, the regiment destroyed the finest infantry in Europe. Salamanca proved that Wellington's understanding of his troops was total. He knew exactly when to unleash the devil's own. He understood that their chaotic energy, if channeled correctly, was an unstoppable force. The victory at Salamanca broke the French grip on Spain, and as the news travelled back to London, the legend of the Iron Duke grew. But in the dusty camps of Spain, the men knew the truth. It was a victory won as much by the accents of Connaught as by the orders of the commander. The road to France was now open, but the cost would continue to mount, and the complex relationship between the Irish soldier and his English king was about to enter its final, bloody chapter. As the year 1813 turned, the tide of the war shifted irrevocably. Wellington's army, now a hardened instrument of war, prepared to do the unthinkable, cross the Pyrenees and invade France itself. This was the moment the British army ceased to be a defensive force protecting Portugal and became an invading juggernaut. But as they marched through the mountain passes, shivering in the biting cold, a listener walking among the campfires would have heard a soundscape that defied the king's regulations. Amidst the crackle of wood and the clinking of muskets, the air was filled not just with English, but with the rhythmic, guttural cadence of Gaelic. By this stage of the war, the Irish presence in the ranks had cemented itself as the army's dominant cultural undercurrent. In some battalions, Gaelic was the primary language of the rank and file, a fact that often bewildered newly arrived English officers. These men, the sons of Connaught and Munster, carried their culture with them. They sang Irish ballads, told stories of the Sidhe, the fairy folk, and maintained a fierce tribal loyalty to their specific regiments that superseded allegiance to the abstract concept of Britain. For many, the redcoat was simply a uniform. The regiment was their country. Wellington, the Dubliner, understood this better than anyone. While the Horse Guards in London fretted over the wildness of the Irish troops and constantly pushed for more respectable English recruits, Wellington pushed back. He knew that the rough-hewn men of the Irish bogs were survivors. They could endure the freezing rain of the Pyrenees and the scarcity of rations with a grim humour that softer men lacked. He defended them against the bureaucrats, famously remarking on their physical endurance and their reckless bravery. He didn't try to force them to be English, he simply required them to be soldiers. This period also highlights the profound paradox of the Irish soldier. These men were almost exclusively Catholic, fighting for a Protestant state that legally barred them from holding public office or sitting in Parliament. They were conquering France, a Catholic nation that had long been a traditional ally of Irish revolutionaries. Yet, there was no mass desertion, no mutiny. Why? The answer lies in the complex relationship between the Anglo-Irish officer and the Irish soldier. It was a feudal bond transplanted to the battlefield. The soldiers looked to leaders like Wellington, Pakenham and Beresford not as representatives of a hostile government, but as the gentry, figures of authority who, in the twisted logic of the time, were their people, distinct from the English. The invasion of France was brutal. The battles of the Nivelle and the Nivelle were fought in terrible conditions, mud and blood mixing in equal measure. Here, the sheer aggression of the Irish regiments proved vital. In the close-quarters fighting of the French villages, the rough-and-tumble skills of the Havocake lads and the Connaught footpads were unleashed. They fought with a terrifying intimacy, clearing houses and hedgerows with the bayonet. It was ugly, visceral warfare, and Wellington presided over it all with his characteristic coolness. But cracks in the Iron Duke persona began to show. Observers noted that when the pressure was highest, when the battle hung in the balance, Wellington's carefully cultivated English accent would slip. In the heat of giving orders, the flat vowels of the Dublin aristocracy would punch through. It was a subtle reminder that the man directing this vast, multinational orchestra was, at his core, a product of Merrion Street. He was not an outsider observing the Irish troops. He was cut from the same cloth, separated only by religion and class, but bound by geography and temperament. As they pushed deeper into France, the end of the war seemed in sight. Napoleon was crumbling, but there was one final act to play out, a coda that would require the ultimate sacrifice. The army that emerged from the Pyrenees was tired, ragged, and undeniably magnificent. They had marched from the coast of Portugal to the heart of France. They had defeated every marshal Napoleon had sent against them, and as they prepared for the final confrontations, the Irish regiments stood at the forefront, their green identity proudly displayed within the red ranks, ready to write the final lines of the Napoleonic epic in their own blood. When the smoke cleared after Waterloo in 1815, the world had changed. Napoleon was exiled, the wars were over, and Arthur Wellesley was the most famous man in Europe. He was showered with titles, estates, and wealth. He became the Duke of Wellington, a pillar of the British establishment. But peace brought a new kind of battlefield, one far more treacherous than the hills of Spain, the floor of the House of Lords. And it was here, in the murky waters of politics, that his Irish heritage would surface in the most explosive way possible. The great unresolved issue of the age was the Catholic question. For centuries, laws had barred Catholics, the vast majority of the Irish population, from sitting in Parliament or holding high office. To the English establishment, this was a necessary safeguard for the Protestant state. To the Irish, it was a suffocating injustice. As Wellington transitioned from soldier to statesman, eventually becoming Prime Minister in 1828, this issue threatened to tear the United Kingdom apart. Here we see the unique pragmatism of the Anglo-Irish mind at work. A purely English Tory Prime Minister might have ignored the rumblings from across the Irish Sea, viewing them as distant troubles. But Wellington knew Ireland. He knew the temper of its people. He had seen the Catholic rent being collected. He had watched the rise of Daniel O'Connell's mass movement. And most importantly, he remembered the faces of the men in the 88th and the 87th regiments. He knew that if pushed too far, the Irish would not just protest, they would fight. And he knew, perhaps better than anyone alive, that a British army filled with Irish Catholics could not be relied upon to suppress an Irish Catholic rebellion. In a move that stunned his own party and outraged the king, the Iron Duke decided to surrender. He didn't do it out of a newfound liberal idealism. He remained a staunch conservative who believed in the existing social order. He did it because he was a strategist. He famously told the House of Lords that having spent his life in war, he would sacrifice his life to save his country from even 1 month of civil war. It was a cold, calculated assessment. The cost of exclusion was now higher than the cost of inclusion. This decision led to one of the most bizarre spectacles in British political history. The Earl of Winchelsea, a fanatical anti-Catholic, published a letter accusing Wellington of betraying the Protestant constitution and insinuating he was a traitor to his class. In 1829, insults like that demanded blood. Wellington, the victor of Waterloo, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, a man of 60 years, challenged Winchelsea to a duel. On a misty morning in Battersea Fields, the two men met. It was a scene straight out of a melodrama. The Duke, cool as ever, raised his pistol. Winchelsea, perhaps realizing the insanity of shooting at the national hero, kept his arm down. Accounts vary, but it is generally accepted that Wellington fired wide intentionally, or perhaps just to startle, and Winchelsea fired into the air in apology. The honour was satisfied, but the point was made. Wellington was willing to risk his life and his government to pass the Catholic Emancipation Act. When the Act passed in 1829, it was the single greatest liberation of the Irish people in centuries. It allowed Catholics to sit in Westminster and open the door to modern Irish democracy. It is a profound irony that this freedom was delivered not by a revolutionary, but by the ultimate symbol of British imperialism. Yet it makes perfect sense when we view Wellington not as an Englishman, but as an Irishman, who understood the precarious nature of his own island. He had led Irishmen to die for the empire. Now, he had forced the empire to acknowledge them as citizens. The sepoy general had become the emancipator, but the gratitude of his countrymen would be complicated, and his legacy in the land of his birth remained a tangled knot of pride and resentment. Walk through the Phoenix Park in Dublin today, and you will see it. The Wellington Testimonial. It is a massive obelisk, the tallest in Europe, piercing the grey Irish sky. It stands as a silent, imposing reminder of the city's most famous son. Yet, for nearly 2 centuries, the man it honours has been metaphorically expatriated. The Victorians, in their zeal to create a national mythology, smoothed over the rough edges of the Iron Duke. They turned him into a marble saint of English reserve, stripping away the complexity, the contradictions, and yes, the Irishness that defined him. This Anglicisation of Wellington was not just a biographical error, it was a deliberate act of historical revisionism. In the narrative of the 19th century, the British Empire was a civilizing force radiating from London. It was inconvenient to admit that its greatest defender was a man born in a Dublin townhouse, raised in a decaying Meath castle, who spoke with the lilt of the Pale. It was equally inconvenient to acknowledge that the thin red line was often a thin green line. The Irish soldier was celebrated as a brave but simple creature, a caricature of the fighting Paddy, while the strategic genius that directed him was claimed solely for England. But when we look closer at Wellington's mind, we see the fingerprints of his heritage everywhere. His leadership style was arguably more Anglo-Irish than English. The English military tradition of the time was often rigid, formal, and obsessed with purchase and precedence. Wellington, however, was the master of the reverse slope, of hiding his strength, of deception, of adaptability. He possessed a grim, gallows humour that is distinctly Irish. When a cannonball took off Lord Uxbridge's leg at Waterloo, and Uxbridge cried, "By God, sir, I've lost my leg," Wellington's dry response, "By God, sir, so you have," is the kind of understatement that one might hear in a Dublin pub, a refusal to indulge in melodrama even in the face of horror. Furthermore, his relationship with the scum of the earth was not one of distant disdain, but of familiar, almost feudal obligation. He was the great landlord of the army. He complained about them, he punished them, but he fed them and he won for them. This dynamic mimics the structure of the society he grew up in. It was a harsh, unequal world, but it was one where the survival of the leader and the led were inextricably linked. He didn't need to learn how to command men who were culturally different and potentially hostile. He had been born into that reality. The erasure of Wellington's Irish identity also serves to erase the contribution of the hundreds of thousands of Irishmen who fought and died under his command. By reclaiming Wellington as an Irish figure, we are not stealing a hero from Britain. We are opening the door to the forgotten ghosts of the 88th, the 87th, and the 27th Inniskillings. We are allowing the history of the Napoleonic Wars to be what it truly was, a shared, messy, multinational endeavour. As we approach the end of our journey, we must confront the final irony. The man who defeated Napoleon, who secured the British century, was a man who belonged everywhere and nowhere. He was too Irish for the English, who mocked his background behind his back, and too British for the Irish nationalists, who saw him as the enforcer of colonial rule. He existed in the liminal space of the Anglo-Irish, a class that would eventually disappear from history. Their great houses burned and their influence waned, but Wellington remains. He is the titan of that lost tribe. To understand him fully, we must stop looking at the statue in London, stiff and silent. We must look back to the boy in Dangan Castle, listening to the violin music of his eccentric father, watching the rain sweep across the Bog of Allen, and learning the first lessons of survival. The Iron Duke was cast in an Irish mould, and it is only by acknowledging this that the metal of the man truly shines. On September 14th, 1852, the great heart finally stopped beating at Walmer Castle. When the news broke, a hush fell over the empire. The state funeral that followed was one of the grandest spectacles Victorian Britain had ever witnessed. Over 1 million people lined the streets of London to watch the massive funeral car, made from the melted down bronze of captured French cannons, trundle towards St. Paul's Cathedral. In that moment, he was the property of the nation, the British nation. The eulogies spoke of English grit, English duty, and English glory. The Dublin years, the Connaught Rangers, the intricate dance of his Anglo-Irish identity, all were buried under the weight of imperial pageantry. But as we stand at the end of our investigation, we can no longer accept that simplified eulogy. We have walked the streets of Georgian Dublin, where he was born. We have tramped through the humid jungles of India, where he learned his trade alongside sepoys and Irish adventurers. We have stood on the ridges of the peninsula, where the Devil's Own shattered the French lines at his command. The evidence is overwhelming. To strip Arthur Wellesley of his Irishness is to render him incomplete. It is like trying to understand a building while ignoring its foundation. Acknowledging Wellington's Irish roots does something profound to our understanding of the 19th century. It shatters the convenient, binary narrative of British oppressor and Irish victim. It forces us to confront a messier, more uncomfortable, and ultimately more human reality: that the history of these islands is inextricably interwoven. The British Empire was not a monolithic English enterprise. It was a joint venture, often forged by the ambition, blood, and intellect of the Irish, Scots, and Welsh. Wellington was the avatar of this union. He embodied its contradictions, its ruthlessness, and its staggering success. For modern Ireland, reclaiming Wellington is a complex challenge. He was a unionist, a Tory, and a man who enforced the rule of London. He is not a hero in the vein of Wolfe Tone or Michael Collins, yet he is undeniably a part of the Irish story. To deny him is to deny the experience of the hundreds of thousands of Irishmen who took the King's shilling. It is to erase the memory of the tenant farmers who walked off the land and into the history books at Talavera, Salamanca, and Waterloo. By recognizing Wellington, we recognize them. We give voice to the silent battalions who marched behind him, whose Gaelic whispers have been lost to the wind. And for Britain, the reassessment is equally vital. It requires a humility to admit that the archetypal Englishman was an import. It requires an understanding that the stoicism, the humour, and the adaptability that defined the Victorian ideal were, in this instance, born of the Anglo-Irish experience. It suggests that the island story is actually an island story, a shared narrative that cannot be unpicked without unravelling the whole tapestry. So, the next time you see a portrait of the Iron Duke, look past the red coat and the Field Marshal's baton. Look at the eyes of a man who grew up in the shadow of Dangan Castle, who navigated the chaotic politics of the ascendancy, and who knew that the world was a dangerous place that required a sharp mind and a harder will. Imagine him not in the hushed halls of Westminster, but on a dusty road in Spain, surrounded by the smell of black powder and unwashed bodies. Listen closely through the din of history. You might just hear it. Not the clipped, polished tones of a purely English legend, but the faint, undeniable lilt of a Dubliner, commanding the scum of the earth to save the world. The Duke of Wellington was many things: a warrior, a statesman, a legend. But before he was any of that, he was Arthur of Dublin. And in the end, perhaps that made all the difference. History is rarely as black and white as the marble statues we build to honour it. By viewing the Iron Duke through the lens of his Irish heritage, we don't diminish his British legacy, we deepen it, revealing the complex, multi-layered human being beneath the uniform. But what do you think? Does knowing about Wellington's Dublin roots and his reliance on Irish troops change how you view the Battle of Waterloo? Or is he still, to you, the ultimate Englishman? I'd love to read your take in the comments below, especially if you have ancestors who served in those Connaught regiments. If you enjoyed this expedition into the forgotten archives of the Empire, please leave a like. It helps us keep these stories alive. Share this video with a fellow history buff who thinks they know everything about the Napoleonic Wars, and make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss our next discovery. Until next time, keep questioning the narrative.